Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's great to be here. I hope you guys are having a great day so far and a good week. Um, so today we are going to do a lecture over the emergence of civilization in the Near East. The Near East is the Mesopotamian region. We talked about this a lot last week, so this isn't too new for you if you watched the lecture from last week. If you are behind, it's time to dig deep and to catch up. You need to make sure that you finish. Let me share my screen here. You need to make sure that you finish this assignment that we did last week, because you have a quiz that will be assigned later on this week, okay? So it is important that you get that completed and get it turned in, okay? So that way you're prepared for the quiz on Friday. Also, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to do our lecture real quick. Don't forget that you can always reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns, or if you just need some help. I'm here to help you. But if you don't reach out, remember, I cannot help you. So this week, as you know, as I said earlier, we're discussing ancient Near Eastern civilizations. And this is the emergence, the build. This includes everything from everything between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers and the Nile. And then this will lead into ancient Greece. This is pretty cool because this will set the stage for classical Egypt and classical Greece, which we will start next week. We'll get right into it. So this is the ancient Near East. This is called the Fertile Crescent, which is right in here. And then the Nile is here, right? So if I annotate, this is what we call the Fertile Crescent right here. And this over here is the Nile, the Fertile Crescent. Anyway, so this lecture deals with the rise of the two earliest civilizations of the ancient Near East, one in Mesopotamia and the other in Egypt. The region is collectively known as the Fertile Crescent, and civilizations emerged here in the 4th millennium BC, which is 4000 to 3000 BC. So when you say you want a revolution, right, we have the Neolithic Revolution. These civilizations were formed by changes that began a millennia earlier, and the most important being the agricultural or the Neolithic Revolution, which occurred around 10,000 BC. Around this time, people in these regions began settling down into villages. They began farming and domesticating animals. And water, as we talked last week, is extremely important. It took thousands of years for the first cities to emerge. The first cities that emerged in the region in southern Mesopotamia were known as Sumer. The Uruk was the largest and the most prominent, with about 50,000 people. These cities were actually called city-states. Each city was independent of the other, and were controlled hinterland of roughly 10 miles surrounding those cities. So when I say a city-state, imagine a country that is literally the size of just one city or town, something like that, okay? So some of the Sumerian city-states, this is a ziggurat up here, and these are their gods. Here are some of the more Sumerian city-states. Though politically independent, they did share certain features. Each city was surrounded by walls, and each had monuments and temples at its core called the ziggurat. Sumerians believed that a deity or a god lived in this ziggurat and watched over the community. The Uruk, for instance, was protected by Inannu Ishtar, by Nana Sin. So this is important because even though we consider this the Sumerian civilization, each city is its own country, right? But they are connected by language, culture, and philosophy and beliefs. So this is the ziggurat at Ur. This is what it is today. And then after much restoration work, this is what it looks like now. So they did do some restoring of this. This is like a reconstruction. This is what it would look like. This literally is a person. And this is cuneiform. So this is the first writing system to develop in the Near East, and it's called cuneiform, which is a wedge-shaped like writing system, right? So it's symbols. So we have symbols of cows, or two dashes, which would like two squiggly dashes end up becoming a cow later on. This is where the Epic of Gilgamesh comes in. I actually have this book in the class. with the classroom. So this was one of the first things to be written down. It is an epic poem that provides great examples of Sumerian writing. Other Sumerians wrote about politics, mathematics, botany, and astronomy. They used a base 60 mathematical system. For instance, this is still used today in keeping time and geometry. 60 minutes, 360-degree circle. So this is extremely important even in today's world. So if you read the Gilgamesh's lips, right? So more importantly, Sumerian cuneiform allowed Sumerian culture and ideas to spread throughout Mesopotamia and beyond. In Syria, for instance, scribes used Sumerian cuneiform and also read and copied Sumerian texts. Others adopted the script, but for their own language. Sumer was the cultural beacon of the time. So this is the rise of Acadia. The Sumerians were never politically unified, right? We talked about this, city-states. Though a few kings did manage to conquer some cities every now and then, instead this unification came through outside conquests. So the Akkadians lived in Akkad, which was their capital, which is a little bit further northwest of Sumer. And these conquerors, they came through right from the north, and they were ethnically distinct from the Sumerians. They spoke a different language. This is more related to the Hebrew and the Arabic languages. And they worshiped their own gods, but they had been heavily influenced by the Sumerian culture. Think about like Canada above the United States, right? Like they're different culture, but they're also very connected to the US. So they become the Akkadian Empire, and they conquer. Sargon the Great conquers Sumer and establishes this first empire in Mesopotamia. This is in Asia Minor. Sargon created this empire, and his successors tried to impose some cultural unity. But then it just falls apart after Sargon. So what you just seen is after the collapse of Sargon's empire, independent city-states still become the norm again. However, around 2100 BC, unity on a lesser scale was restored under the third dynasty of the city of Ur. We call it Ur III. There was a renaissance, a raison-être of sorts of Sumerian culture at this time, but it fizzled out around the year 2000 BC, as did Ur III. So then we're going to pivot over to Egypt, where the second earliest civilization does emerge along the Nile River Valley. So the Nile was central to the development of the Egyptian civilization. It divided Egypt into two lands, originally two separate kingdoms. So Egypt is literally the land of duality, right? They are by twos on almost everything that they do. After its annual floods, this land was fertile and life-giving. But during off seasons, it was parched and dead. So if you notice, Egypt develops right along the river, right? Because everything out here is desert. They have to have the water. Not surprisingly, Egyptians were a bit obsessed with life and death. Their chief deities, Horus and Osiris, provided proof. One of the god of living and the other of dead. Finally, the Egyptian king, later called a pharaoh, was key. He was a god king, essentially Horus on earth, and guaranteed the annual flooding of the Nile. When he died, he became Osiris. Egyptians were pretty metal when it comes to stuff like this. So the Old Kingdom lasted from 2600 to 2150 BC. And these ideas largely came into being during the earliest period of Egyptian history. This is like unification. This is the bringing of the two countries together. The Old Kingdom. During this time, Upper and Lower Egypt were unified, and a capital was established at Memphis. The king, later Pharaoh, wore a double crown, which is symbolic of this unity. Other hallmarks of Egyptian civilization also appeared at this time. So then we have hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphic writing became ubiquitous during the Old Kingdom, as did Egyptian literature. Hieroglyphic means literally a scarred carving, and many surviving hieroglyphs are indeed religious inscriptions. Pyramids are also products of the older Kingdom Egypt. The first stone pyramid was erected by Pharaoh Dozier. These kinds of pyramids were stepped in nature, but eventually grand pyramids like those at Giza and monuments like the Great Sphinx were also constructed. Pyramids were an elaborate burial monument for the deceased that functioned as places of worship long after their burial. Vast amounts of time, energy, and money were devoted to the construction of these pyramids, demonstrating just how central and important the pharaoh was to the Egyptian culture and society. So remember, pharaohs are gods on earth. So when they die, they actually become a god resurrected for them to worship. These pyramids are a place for that worship to happen. So this is like our first intermediate period. And there's no authorita. So various factors led to local challenges to the pharaoh's power during the 2100s in BC. Eventually, the central authority collapsed altogether, and regions of Egypt simply ruled themselves. This period is known as the first intermediate period, first, because as you're going to see, there's more than one. So we have the Middle Kingdom, which expands after reunification. The next period in Egyptian history is known as the Middle Kingdom, which witnessed the reunification through the efforts of the new dynasty established at Thebes, which is more of a centralized capital than Memphis, which is more north, which is close to the future city of Alexandria, established during Alexander the Great's empire. So then we have expansion and we have new ideas. So these Theban pharaohs attempted to increase their power and authority through expansion. Nubia was conquered in the south, and the Nubians were forced to pay tribute, and Fayum region was placed under cultivation. Commercial relations were established with the Levant, and mining operations were set up in the Sinai Peninsula. So the Sinai Peninsula is right here. The Levant, think modern day Israel, and the location of Jerusalem. So Nubia is down here, Fayum is here. But as I said earlier, Fayum is in the desert, right? So what they do is they learn how to create canals where they filter the water through here, and they slowly make this out here a cultivated land for farming. This is extremely cool engineering feats. I'll probably post a video called Engineering an Empire for Egypt next week, and it won't be required to watch it. It'll just be for a resource. It's also like a really, really cool documentary. Finally, this period witnessed the emergence of new ideas. Despite attempts to increase his authority, for instance, the pharaoh's monopolization of elaborate burial came to an end. Anyone who wanted a pyramid and could afford one, in other words, they got one. But the development is often referred to as the democratization of the death. Though only the wealthy and powerful really benefited, people also thought differently about pharaohs. They ceased to be the infallible god kings and became instead divinity-sanctioned stewards of Egypt and good shepherds for their people. So we have empire building in the East, Europe, and the Middle East. Eastern Europe, in the Middle East. This part of the lecture treats like important developments that occurred during the second millennium BC, including the arrival of new peoples, the rise of larger armies and kingdoms in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and beyond, and the emergence of an international community of sorts. So this is our Near East, right? We have the Mesopotamian city-states, and we have the Middle Kingdom. Then we have Indo-Europeans called the Hittites, the Hurrians, and the Hyksos, and all of these different people that move in during the second intermediate period in Egypt. We have Hammurabi, who comes out of Babylon and conquers the old Assyrian Empire, the old Akkadian Empire, and establishes the Babylonian Empire, right? So Hammurabi then wrote his code, right, which is another legacy of this law code, which is rather harsh, but it's literally an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. It's actually really in depth, and it became the main law code that establishes law and order. It even reaches all the way in today's world. So this is the Near East in 1750 BC. We have a lot of people that are just moving around. The Hyksos is now in charge of Egypt during the second intermediate period, and Hammurabi's kingdom collapsed shortly after his death. And it came under increased pressure from the Hittites, who actually sacked Babylon around 1600. While its southern lands, Sumer proper, were invaded and conquered by new peoples known as the Kassites. The Kassites also adopted the language and culture of the region, but brought a new weapon as well, called the war chariot. This revolutionizes military warfare in the Near East. Yes, the war chariot, which replaced simple infantry militias, a war chariot could be manned by 2 or 3 individuals. One drove and the other 2 fired arrows with a bow. It was fast and allowed armies to travel great distances and decimated infantry-only armies. By 1500, everyone in the ancient Near East had adopted them, and allowing for the emergence of multiple large kingdoms and empires. So we're going to have a battle between the Hittites and the Egyptians. And we'll see. So they have like a really cool battle. Boom, boom, boom. The Hittites do win, and they conquer some of Egypt, if you didn't know. By 1500, there are 5 major kingdoms and regions in the, kingdoms and empires in the region. In this class, we focused a bit on Egypt, which emerged during the ruler of Thebes, ousted the Hyksos, reuniting Upper and Lower Egypt and assuming the title Pharaoh. This period is also known as the New Kingdom or Empire in Egypt. During it, Egyptian pharaohs expanded greatly, conquering Nubia, pushing into the land of Punt, which is south of Nubia, and conquering portions of the Levant and Syria, where they left soldiers. Egypt, to this point, rather isolated, took a more international flavor as new ideas and indeed new peoples made their way into the Egyptian kingdom. Akhenaten. This is really important. So some of the new ideas were spiritual. Pharaoh Amenhotep IV provided a case in point. He flirted with a kind of monotheism. Mono means one God. Polytheism means more than one. So mono meaning one and poly meaning more than one. And he claimed that the sun god Aten was the only real god for Egypt. And he closed all the other temples in Egypt and took the name Akhenaten, which means he who served Aten willingly. Few liked him, and his successor, Tutankhamun, promptly changed his name to Tutankhaten, and then he changed his name to Tutankhamun, and reopened the old temples. The New Kingdom art is cool, though. No? I mean, that's a pretty cool, like, sun, right? So this is the Near East. We have the kingdom of Mitanni up here, which is like kind of falling apart. Diplomacy, peace treaties, and alliances came to be offered as alternatives to war. So people are learning how to negotiate and how to bring people together. So this is the Treaty of Kadesh from Ramses III and Hattusili III. And as a result, an international community of sorts, kind of like your first United Nations, emerged in the second millennium. Rulers of these kingdoms referred to each other as brothers. They exchanged friendly letters. Of course, this does collapse because almost every alliance does, if you haven't studied any bit of history. And then we have this Dark Ages. Things are good, but then there's some more invasions in these kingdoms. They just pretty much collapse. We have the third intermediate period in Egypt. We have Babylonian civilizations, which literally just becomes a city-state. Same with Assyria. There's a bunch of city-states along the Levant, Jerusalem, all of these areas. And then the Levantine people come out of the darkness. So after the Sea Peoples, we call it the Sea Peoples. We don't know where they came from, but they come through and they just mess everything up. And literally we pivot into the 12th century. So we have people that come over here. We have more people that come this way. The Libyans, all of these, the Habirus, which is kind of like the Hebrews maybe. We'll get into that. Then we have more Sea Peoples. We have the Iron Age. This is where things change. Some good things that also happened during this Dark Age. Iron, for instance, replaces bronze as the metal of choice, ushering in this Iron Age. Iron rules. Iron products are more easily mass-produced and superior in quality. And we have Phoenicia. Despite the absence of large empires, certain peoples in the Levant, such as the Phoenicians, recovered from the disruption of this period. Phoenicia is really important. It is the foundation for language in Europe. So they colonize all of these regions, all the way out to Carthage and Cadiz and Spain, Sicily. They have a great influence on ancient Greece and the early Romans. So the Phoenician alphabet, the entire world actually owes the Phoenicians a big thank you card. They invented the so-called Phoenician alphabet, which is the basis for all written alphabets in the world, save those based upon the Chinese alphabet. See the above map, right? So Greek, Latin, and early Roman languages that has over 600 symbols, and it was much easier to use, and thus it took off everywhere. By the end of the Dark Ages, people throughout the Near East and beyond had adopted and modified this alphabet. We'll also see the Greeks do this as well as the Romans. And we have some of their gods. It's just literally a melting pot of all the other gods of the world. But I will take note right here. This is Yahweh, which is the son of El, a cupbearer. This is also adopted by the Jews and ancient Israelites with Christianity. But oh no, biblical stuff. So speaking of ancient, I feel like I should do that a little bit. Oh no, biblical stuff. Speaking of ancient Jews, talking about religion can be tricky and a potential source of discomfort for some people. That said, please bear in mind that this is a history class and that whatever your personal faith or your lack thereof, I am not preaching here. That's what this image above is meant to indicate. The rest of this lecture will talk about the origins of Judaism. It may conflict with what you've been taught in the past. It is, however, what most historical scholars do believe, and you don't have to believe it to study it. Okay. So this is the Dark Ages in the Old Testament. So towards the end of, right in here, the Bible gets written down towards the end of the Dark Ages. Archaeological evidence and some other written sources have informed what follows. The Old Testament, however, remains a key source for history. It is a key source for history, and it is important. So we have Israelites, not Abraham Lincoln, but Abraham is important because he travels a lot of places. So Israelite history begins with Father Abraham, who was supposedly from Ur, no kidding, and immigrated to the Levant, which is where Jerusalem is. His descendants eventually made their way to Egypt and were enslaved. Now, around 1200 BC, they're led out of Egypt by Moses, a nice Egyptian name, wandered a bit, and then settled in the land of Canaan. This is South Phoenicia. This migration is known as the Exodus. It would become a central experience of the Israelite and later Jewish people. While wandering in the desert, they adopted Yahweh, which is Jehovah, as their patron deity, becoming henotheists rather than strict monotheists. In short, they still believed in some other gods, the golden calf. But they agreed to worship only Yahweh. No way, Yahweh. Sorry, I couldn't resist. So Israelites, the Ark of the Covenant, and Shiloh. So this is kind of important right here. The Philistines and the Israelite tribes are next to the Philistines, right? So they're right over here, okay? We have David and Solomon. We have Solomon's temple. This is at their greatest extent. All of this in orange and in yellow. So soon the monarchy slipped and collapsed, and two separate kingdoms emerged over the course of the 9th century. To the north was Israel, which was more tribal in orientation and had its capital at Samaria. To the south was Judah, where we get the term Jew from. It means inhabitants of Judah, which was essentially the perpetuation of David and Solomon's kingdoms, just on a smaller scale. These two kingdoms lasted into the mid-8th century, but then a new power, Assyria, changed everything. Assyria comes in and invades. And then we have the mega empires. This part of the lecture looks at the emergence of vast empires following the Dark Ages and its consequences in the ancient Near Eastern world. So we have the Assyrian slow rise. These first mega empires was the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians had nearly been conquered by the Armenians during the Dark Ages, but they hung in there. By the end of the 10th century, they had gotten good at fighting, reformed their military, adopted iron and various siege technologies, and defeated surrounding Armenians, and then expanded outward, though were checked for a while by the Phoenicians and the Israelites. Under Tiglath-Pileser III, Assyria renewed its expansion, conquering Syria and Phoenicia, making Israel and Judah vassals, and conquering Babylon. The image to the right celebrates the siege of Babylon. This is over here. His successors continued his expansion, creating a vast empire. Shalmaneser added Israel after a failed revolt. So they revolt. Sargon added more of the Levant and Mesopotamia and founded a new capital at Nineveh. So we're conquering more. And I don't know how to say that name, guys. Sennacherib, maybe? And Ashurbanipal, at least for a while, conquered Egypt. Yeah. So this empire's literally all of the Near East. So then we have some consequences at home. We have money, booty, slaves, and new ideas. An empire of this magnitude was bound to have consequences. Money, booty, slaves, and new ideas flooded back to the Assyrian cities. Which grew rich, prosperous, and also quite multicultural as a result. The Assyrians, for instance, adopted the Aramaic and started using the Phoenician alphabet. They also decorated their cities with glorious palaces and statues. The consequences abroad were less good. You can get a sense of the brutality of the Assyrians from these Assyrian images. They celebrate terror more or less. So while some Assyrian rulers patronized those they conquered, especially when obedient, they were ruthless to those who were disobedient and rebelled. When the inhabitants of Israel were voted, Sargon II destroyed Samaria and deported everyone to Assyria. He then settled the Assyrians in the region, and these Israelites never heard from again. They were called the lost tribes of Israel. This is also mentioned in the Bible. Then we have another revolution. Such brutality did endear the peoples of this empire to their Assyrian masters, and in the 620s, a number of subjects conspired together and successfully revolted. In the west, Egypt remained its independence, reestablishing the rule of the Egyptian pharaoh. This is known as the Sattite period or dynasty within Egypt. Judah also became independent for a while. In the east, on the other hand, the Babylonian people and the Medes revolted and literally sacked all the major cities of the Assyrian Empire. Nineveh and Ashur were reduced to mere villages. And then some new empires, still quite large, took the Neo-Assyrian Empire's place. Boom. The first was the Median Empire, which we know very little about. And the second was the Neo-Babylonian Empire, about which we know quite a bit because they wrote it down. This empire witnessed a flourishing of Mesopotamian culture. Babylon was rebuilt, and two of the original seven wonders of the ancient world, Hanging Gardens and Ishtar Gate, were constructed. Despite being terrorized by the Assyrians, Babylonians adopted their policies of terror when it came to unwilling subjects. The Jews of Judah provide a case in point. During the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, they were made into vassals but revolted. In 598, Nebuchadnezzar attacked the city and plundered it, deporting its leaders. 9 years later, they revolt again. This time, the city was burned to the ground. Solomon's temple was destroyed, and the entire population was deported to the city of Babylon. This was a central event in the formation of the Jewish people and Judaism religion itself. This is also extremely important. It's a big event in the Bible. During this Babylonian captivity, they maintained a communal identity that focused on worship of Yahweh alone. They became increasingly monotheistic, in other words. They also began to compile and edit the earliest books of the Bible. In sum, and though a gross oversimplification, the Babylonian captivity gave birth to both Jewish monotheism and the earliest versions of the Old Testament, which would become the foundation for Christianity. So what is a sin-er? King Nabonidus eventually alienated even the Babylonians, namely by honoring the god Sin, more than Marduk. While this was going on, Cyrus, a governor of the Median Empire, staged a coup, giving birth to the Persian Empire. Boom. Cyrus then expanded into Asia Minor, where he met some Greeks. He then conquered Babylon, where he honored Marduk and ended the Babylonian captivity. People like that. His son, Cambyses, later annexed Egypt in 525, thus ending the Sattite monarchy. So they have the Persian Empire, which is the largest empire to date in the world, with a multiplicity of peoples and cultures who had a history of being abused and by those who conquered them. The Persians, however, were generally kind to their subjects and allowed them some autonomy to rule themselves. They also innovated, but in ways that helped them rule a vast empire. They built roads. They also created a kind of pony express for conveying orders quickly throughout the empire. In addition, they created provinces called stratopies and governors to rule them, satraps, who were often local elites. Syrian satraps ruled Syria, for example, and lastly, they created a kind of a CIA with spies and the like to keep people in order. So then we have Zoroastrianism. Finally, Zoroastrianism was a Persian religion that led to profound influence on Jewish and Christian thought. Zoroaster was a prophet who lived around 12 BC, and his teachings are recorded in a book known as the Avesta. Zoroastrians and dualists who believe in a good god and an evil god, both assisted by lesser spirits called the Azata and the Deva, respectively. These two gods are locked in an epic struggle, and mankind is caught in the middle. So it's kind of like heaven and hell, and people are just in the middle, forced to choose between good and evil. When Ahura, which is the good god, man will be judged, the good rewarded, and the bad punished eternally. It is not difficult to see how this influenced Judeo-Christians and indeed Islamic ideas. Angels and demons is actually a good root word for the devil, and heaven and hell, the last judgment. These are the Zoroastrian ideas. And the Magi from the New Testament, they may be Zoroastrian priests called Magi and other Greek sources. So in other words, Zoroastrianism has a huge impact on the development of Judaism as a belief in the world. And we have the Persian Wars. So there's lots of names, events, and dates, but don't worry, this is the simplicity of it. Persians conquer Asia Minor. Ionians revolt and get mainland assistance. Persians invade Greece, but they fail. Persians try again. They fail again. Greeks liberate the coast of Asia Minor, and And then we have the rise of the Athenians in Athens. Okay? That's everything that happened. We have the Ionian Revolt right here. And because Athens and these Greeks help these revolts, the Persians get angry, of course, so they invade. Darius did not give up. He tried again, and this time Datis, he puts these people in command, right? And they sail with an army of 30,000 directly to Greece. Here they besiege this place and capture it, and they burn it to the ground. Following this, they march towards Athens. But they lose again. This is Marathon. So this is where we get the Olympics, right? So the Persians land, the Greeks fight them off, and then Miltiades runs all the way back to let everybody know what happened. And that's how we get the Marathon. And then we have Themistocles. So now Darius probably would have invaded again, but his luck would have it he died. So meanwhile, his successor Xerxes faced a serious revolt in Egypt and was distracted from the Greek affairs. Back in Athens, a massive vein of silver was discovered in Lanthrium. The Athenians debated what they should do with it. Themistocles, who feared a Persian invasion, wanted to build a fleet of ships called the Trimene. Aristides, on the other hand, wanted to build monuments in Athens. He feared that a fleet would lead to further democratic reforms in Athens, since rowers, usually poor, would have an important role in military affairs. He also believed that Marathon would have proven that hoplites alone were sufficient to defeat the Persians. So it happens anyway. Xerxes decides to invade, and at Thermopylae, some Spartans stop them. This is basically the movie 300 if you haven't seen it. It's fantastic. So Leonidas stops them on this little plain right here called Thermopylae. But he loses, right, as we know. And he sacks Athens, but he does lose in the end. So then we formed the Delian League. Soon a new league of allied city-states emerged under the Athenians' leadership called the Delian League. It consisted of 150 member cities which allied in a mutual defense against the Persian Empire. Each member contributed money or ships or soldiers to the league's use. Its capital was at Deos, where league business was discussed and its treasury housed. From the start, Athens was a major beneficiary of the league. Athenian generals commanded its army and navy, and Athenians appointed the league's treasurers. Athens was allowed to keep half the spoils of any campaign. Lastly, the league was a success, for by 449, Persia was willing to sign a peace treaty with it and relinquish its claims over Ionia. Boom. So by the end of the 5th century BC, we have a Persian empire that has been humbled by the Greeks, but still is super mega sweet. We have the super militarized quasi-communist Spartans and their Peloponnesian League, and we have a super democratic Athens and its Delian League. So what happens next? So if you've ever seen Rocky IV, you don't get the reference. Creed II is already out, right? So it's just a boxing, just boxing. Meanwhile, Rocky equals America and equals democracy, which equals Athens, and Ivan Drago equals the USSR, which is the Soviet Union, which equals communism, which equals Sparta. Spoiler alert, in Rocky IV, Rocky defeats communism, but will the Athenians be so lucky? Stay tuned to find out, right? So this is just setting the stage for the next 2 weeks as we discuss the Athenians and the Spartans and ancient Greece, and we'll get a little bit more into Egypt, but this lecture covers the next 2 weeks. I went ahead and I've covered the next 2 weeks. So I know this was long. I'll stop sharing, and I'm sorry, bear with me. This is 2 weeks worth of lectures. I decided to just get it all done in one run. So have a great day, and let me know if you need anything.